Hey guys, Adam here with AmericanTrucks.com. Today we're taking a closer look at and installing the Rough Country 2-inch leveling strut extensions available for the 09 and newer F150, excluding 10 to 14 Raptors. You should be checking this out for your own truck if you're looking to fit larger wheels and tires, if you're looking to get a little bit more ground clearance at the front end, and if you're looking to level out your truck's appearance. Now from the factory, the F150 has what's known as factory rake. That means the front end suspension is a little bit lower than the rear to help with towing and hauling applications. Now most guys don't really like the look of that off the factory line, and if you're not towing every single day, you might not want that there in the first place, in which case a leveling kit will bring the front end up a little bit to match the rear. The 2-inch leveling kit here among the categories generally known to be the perfect leveling size to even out the truck's appearance without sacrificing any ride quality or putting any excess stress on your CV axle or other suspension components like your upper control arm ball joint. Now the 2-inch kit just isn't high enough to put that added stress, so you really shouldn't have to worry about any excessive premature wear, and it'll still ride like the factory truck. Now this guy here is made from a proprietary composite material, meaning it is not a billet aluminum or it's not a steel construction like some of the other more generally basic ones in the category. This proprietary material is made to fit right on top of the factory strut assembly, so it doesn't require a spring compressor, and because it's not billet aluminum or steel, you don't have to worry about it rusting out. It's also not going to bend, warp, or break under the load of the truck as per Rough Country. Now this guy comes in right around 50 bucks, making it a pretty affordable way to go in the category. It's a little bit more expensive than the $30 kit, but it's not as expensive as some of the $100. It's a pretty good sweet spot right in the middle. Now this is also going to help you fit larger wheels and tires on your truck. You can fit comfortably up to 33-inch tires without any rubbing or modification necessary. Now if you have 33 by 12.5 per se, that is a little bit of a wider tire. There may be some rubbing at full turn. Some guys don't mind that. Others may trim a little bit in the wheel well liner. It's all personal preference, but you can fit up to 33s. 35s on the other hand, gonna have a tight squeeze with this particular leveling kit. You might want to consider the 2.5 or maybe even the 3-inch option if that's your goal. Now, as far as ground clearance, it will help with some light off-roading situations. 2 inches at the front end in height doesn't change a whole lot, so don't expect to be wheeling over some huge rocks going off-road, but for light obstacles, it can definitely do the trick. The install is going to get a soft 3 out of 3 wrenches on our difficulty meter, simply because 4-wheel drive guys do have to pull vacuum from the 4-wheel drive actuator in the knuckle, which does add a level of difficulty to it. You definitely don't want to damage those parts in particular. 2-wheel drive guys don't have to worry about that. It's a little bit easier of an install process. So if you have the 4-wheel drive, some specialty tools are required. If you're not comfortable doing it yourself, no shame handing it over to a professional. Good news is, no spring compressor required. The install is going to take about 2, maybe 3 hours from start to finish. I'll walk you through the whole process. Let's get to it. Tools used in this install include an air impact gun, regular impact gun and or a ratchet, swivel socket, 30, 15/16, 27, 21, 19, 17, 13, 10, and 8mm deep sockets. 15 and 17mm ratcheting wrenches are definitely recommended, a pry bar, 1/2-inch ratchet, hammer, and a vacuum pump for your 4-wheel drive actuators. All right guys, kicking off the uninstall here. Before we get started, I want to make a quick mention that our 13 F150 we're going to be working on here has its upper control arm replaced. This might look a little different than the one we have here, but just know that the process is exactly the same, and this upper control arm here is not going to change the height whatsoever. So that's out of the way. Let's get started with taking our brake line and our ABS line off of the knuckle and up here toward the frame, just to make sure we have a little bit more slack on it. All right, now there's 2 brackets here on the side, one for the ABS line and one for the brake line. The brake line is a 10mm bolt. This guy's an 8mm. I have the 10mm here. Let's get that one out of the way first. Now what I like to do is disconnect the bracket, and then I'm just gonna put the bolt right back on just so we don't lose it. All right, so now I switched over to an 8mm to do the ABS. All right, now following those brake lines back up here to the frame, there's one more 10mm, so let's switch back over and get that guy off. All right, so now all this has a bunch of slack and we're not going to be putting excess pressure on it. All right, now we have to get our caliper out of the way. Now in order to do that, I'm going to use a 19mm socket and a swivel socket along with my air gun to pop this bolt off and the bottom one down here. Now it's going to remove the entire caliper from the bracket. And I have my caliper hanger, and this is going to help hang the caliper up onto the frame so we're not putting stress on the brake lines as well. I'm going to put that guy there. From here, we're going to work off the caliper. Next step, of course, is to get the rotor out of the way. Now, in most cases, if you pull on it, the guy's probably stuck on there. There's a little bit of rust and corrosion on the inside of that hub there, in which case you can grab a mallet and carefully tap on the outside of the rotor here to dislodge it. There you go, and now we can set this aside. Now we're going to switch back over to the 8mm socket and get our dust shield out of the way. There's 3 bolts holding this guy on, 2 on the bottom, 1 at the top. All right, now I'm going to grab a 3/16 hex socket and we're going to get the ABS sensor off of the hub. So that guy comes out, it's a very small screw. We're going to carefully pull that guy out of the hub. We're just going to let that guy hang off to the side. Now we're going to take our sway bar end link nut off. That's an 18mm deep socket we're going to use, and I'm also going to use a swivel socket just to make life a little bit easier with this air gun. With that guy loosened up, I'm actually just going to keep this on a couple of threads. We wanted to make this loose so that the lower control arm can drop down a little bit. Next up, let's loosen up the upper control arm castle nut. Now this guy here has a retainer pin in the middle, which yours may also be bent on the other side, so you may need to unbend it, and you're basically just going to pull it out from the middle of the castle nut. I'm going to set this aside. Now we're going to use an 18mm deep socket, again the swivel, so basically the same assembly we used for the sway bar end link, and loosen this guy up. Now what I'm going to do is just take that castle nut and thread it on a couple of threads, because we still have to dislodge the upper control arm from the knuckle, and we want to make sure this is on to catch it so it doesn't pop out. So now let's get our tie rod end off. Now I'm going to use a 21mm deep socket to loosen up this nut. Again, the same thing, thread it on a couple of threads. All right, same concept applies to the tie rod end. We have the nut on a couple of threads. I'm going to use a mallet to tap on the backside here, right in the steel portion, so I don't damage the ball joint there, and we'll have that dislodged from the knuckle as well. So if you need to, you can grab a ball peen hammer and tap right on the side of the knuckle there, as you just saw, and that should dislodge it. All right, now we're essentially going to do the same thing for the upper control arm. You can use a ball peen hammer to hit right up against the knuckle there. You do not want to hit the upper control arm ball joint. Make sure you're focusing right there. We're going to do the exact same thing we just did, but to the lower control arm to knuckle joint right here with this 15/16 nut. Perfect. So it doesn't look like we're going to need to hammer that. It looks like it dislodged. If yours does not dislodge like this one just did, you can use a hammer and do the same process, hitting this, making sure you're not damaging the actual ball joint there. Now this next step is a little bit more unique to the four-wheel drive guys. Now if you have four-wheel drive, we have to pull vacuum from the four-wheel drive actuator to disconnect the CV axle from the whole knuckle and hub assembly. The reason we're doing that is to avoid damaging the four-wheel drive actuator and or the CV axle when we're lowering the lower control arm and lifting the truck. Putting that at such a high stress angle, pulling down on it in order to get the strut in and out can cause damage to the four-wheel drive, which is why you're gonna need this tool here, which is a vacuum pump, which is gonna help pull vacuum from the four-wheel drive actuator. We're gonna pull 24 pounds of vacuum using this gauge here. We're gonna disconnect everything we need to, set this aside, and pull the entire hub and knuckle assembly off. All right, now the vacuum line here is right above where the axle connects to the hub. Just gonna pull that guy straight back and disconnect. I'm gonna take my pump and connect the hose to the bigger fitting. All right, now I'm gonna pump this and focus on my gauge here to 24 pounds of pressure. Now I'm gonna carefully set this aside without releasing the pressure. I'm gonna seat that right on our lower control arm there. Now with that pressure pulled, I'm basically gonna disconnect the upper control arm and the tie rod end, and then use a 13mm socket to remove the axle nut. From there, I'll pull the CV axle out of the hub. Now because we relieve that pressure, we'll be able to slide that right out. From there, I'll remove the lower control arm nut and pull the entire knuckle assembly off the truck. All right, so this is all gonna be kind of one motion. So I'm gonna take first off the upper control arm off. Keep that guy down there. I'm gonna put this nut back on just so we don't lose it. And our tie rod end is coming next. Tie rod end, that's gonna go back here. Next what I'm gonna do is use a 13 socket to remove the axle nut, pull the CV axle out of the hub, and remove the lower control arm bolt. All right, so you can see this guy slides right out. Lift up here, remove the lower control arm nut. I'm just gonna drop that to the ground, and this whole assembly is gonna come with me. Just like that. Pull the pump with me, and there you have it. All right, so here I have the entire hub and knuckle assembly on the ground, and I wanna show you guys what the reverse side looks like. This is where the CV axle actually connects to the hub. Inside is our four-wheel drive actuator, and you can see the teeth going all the way around. I still have our pump hooked up. So what I wanna do is I'm gonna show you guys what this actually does to give you some context as to why we need to do it. As it sits, I relieve the pressure. I did not remove any vacuum from this. Here I'm gonna pump, and as I pump, you can see the teeth start to lift up. Pulling vacuum, the 24 pounds that we just did, as you saw, lifted the teeth up. That disengages the four-wheel drive actuator from the CV axle and allows us to slide it out. Now, if I were to relieve that, you'll see this seat back down, and that would, in theory, engage the four-wheel drive. So, pumped up and relieved. You can see it sinks back down into the hub. So that just gives you some context as to why we need to do that. Next, we're gonna remove our bottom strut bolt from the lower control arm. The nut is a 30 millimeter, and the bolt head is a 27. So you're gonna need some specialty sockets. I've got my 27 short socket on my 1/2-inch ratchet, and my 30 socket on my air gun. All right, next we can pull the bolt out. All right, next up we can remove the 3 top strut tower nuts. These are 15 millimeters. I'm gonna use a ratcheting wrench, definitely recommend this. And you're gonna get these guys off. All right, now to get our strut assembly out, I'm gonna use a pry bar right underneath of that, right in this little seat here in the lower control arm. We're basically gonna pry up and outward to get it out of its seat. Slide it down. Now we can set this guy aside. All right, next up is gonna be the assembly of our spacers. Now these spacers are a little bit unique in the category. They're unlike most of the other options out there, and I wanna explain what the situation is with this. Now, looking at one of these spacers, you'll see, first and foremost, there's RC A out, and if you rotate it upside down, RC B out. Now, A out and B out are side specific, but both spacers in the kit will have these labeled. A out is what you want facing the outside of the driver's side of the vehicle. So when you install this on the strut and the strut goes in the truck, A out is gonna be facing you when you're installing it, facing outside of the truck, outer wheel well. B out does the exact same thing, but B out labels the passenger side. So that'll be sticking out of the passenger side wheel well. So because we're on the driver's side, I'm gonna be focusing on A out. Now you'll also notice, secondly, there are a couple of holes drilled throughout. Now each hole are basically doubled. For A out, you're gonna be using the bottom hole for your new studs. So through the back, you're gonna be taking your stud and putting it through the bottom hole on each of the pairs. So it'll look something like this. All right, so we have a stud coming out each bottom hole. Now, unfortunately, they're gonna fall out when we try to put them onto our strut. So what I'm gonna do is take a nut and just tighten them down just from the outside, just to hold them in place. You don't have to worry about any washers just yet. So right from there, I'm gonna put them in my hand just like that and take one of the nuts, not a nylon lock nut, just the regular one. I'm gonna thread that all the way down so the stud gets held in place. Otherwise, that's gonna happen. All right, do the same thing for all 3. Perfect. So now we don't have to worry about them falling out on us. At this point, we can take the spacer and our strut assembly and drop it into place. Now the strut studs at the top of the strut hat are gonna drop into the indented holes here. So not anything on the surface, but in these indented holes. It'll only go on one way, so you just wanna rotate it until it drops onto all 3 studs. Just like that. Might have to put a little pressure on it to make sure it snaps in place. Now we're going to use new nylon lock nuts included in the kit to tighten these guys down. Under the nylon lock nut, you want to make sure you're installing one washer as well. All right, so I got a washer, drop it onto the factory stud, nylon lock nut. I'm going to drop it on and just going to thread it on a couple of threads by hand. Do the same thing for all three. All right, at this point, grab a 17mm deep socket and tighten down the 3 nylon lock nut ones. Now we can take off these nuts because the studs are being held on by the strut hat. We're going to drop this into the truck. Now when you're installing this into the truck, you want to make sure that on top of these studs, you're putting a flat washer and a split washer or lock washer on before the nuts. All right, so these 3 nuts are off. Let's drop it in the truck. All right, now again, when you're installing this, make sure on the driver's side you have A out facing you. So we have that there, and that'll help you align it to the strut tower open holes. All right, with those guys through, grab a flat washer and a lock washer, all right, and then follow that up with a nut. That one on, it'll hold itself in place. Do the same thing for the rest of them. All right, so now what you can do is grab your 17mm ratcheting wrench or whatever method of tightening you're using and tighten these down. Now you'll see when trying to seat the bottom of the strut, we're bottoming out on the sway bar end link nut, so I'm just gonna take this guy off, and that'll give us a little bit more range to pull the lower control arm down. So from here, pull the control arm down and seat the strut. I'm gonna take a pry bar and insert it into the strut seat, and I'm basically prying up to get the bolt hole to line up. Might be a little bit of a trial and error, but you can get it to line, just like that. All right, lift the axle up, thread on the giant nut, and now we can tighten these 2 down. All right, so now you can grab your 30mm socket and your 27 socket for the bolt head and tighten them down. All right, so next is to reassemble our knuckle and hub assembly. Now in order to do that, we have to pull vacuum again. 24 is the magic number. Already have that taken care of here. We also lowered our truck down to the ground, and we're using a hydraulic floor jack to push up on the lower control arm. The reason we're doing that is these 2 angles, due to our lift kit, were at a little bit of a hard angle, and it wasn't lining up with the lower ball joint here and the CV axle. Now, the reason we're jacking that up is to make sure that this can go straight into the hub, line up with the actuator, and lock into place. You want to make sure that you're doing this one properly. Now, this is the most difficult part of this entire process, getting this guy to click back in properly. You want to make sure that the threading comes all the way through the hub. You want to see past the threading just to that little chrome ring right around it. That's how you know it seats all the way in, and it'll be locked into place without any rotation abilities. So now what we're going to do is lift this guy up. Already took the nut off the bottom control arm ball joint, got that placed up here for safekeeping. Lift that guy up and line everything up and click it back into place. All right, so like I said, that is the trickiest part, making sure the threading comes all the way through. I'm gonna put our 13mm nut right on that stud while holding it in place, threading it on as much as I can by hand. Then I'm gonna use a ratchet to carefully tighten it down. You wanna make sure it seats properly. You'll feel if it doesn't seat, and using a ratchet just makes it a little bit easier. There it is. All right, so once you have that tightened down, what you wanna do with vacuum still at 24, rotate this. The axle should move freely in that hub. Now I'm gonna release the vacuum, all right? And then try it again, and it locks in. You can't move that axle freely. That's how you know it's done correctly. If your axle still moves freely once you release that vacuum, you wanna go back and do it again, pull the nut off, make sure it seats all the way in, and repeat that process. From here, we're gonna start reconnecting our components and tightening those components down. At this point, let's tighten up the bottom nut here with a 15/16 socket. All right, next let's do the upper control arm. So I'm gonna take that castle nut off, push the upper control arm through, and I might need to use a pry bar for this guy to finish that off. All right, so now we can put our nut back on, along with the spacers. Now before we tighten those guys down, let's take off the tie rod and nut and seat that back in the knuckle as well. Now we can grab our sockets and tighten them both down. So now I'm gonna grab my 19 socket and my swivel and tighten up the upper control arm. Switching over to a 21 deep to tighten up our tie rod end. You want to make sure the upper control arm castle nut here is lined up with the open hole in the stud. If it is not, you may need to either tighten it or you've gone too tight and need to crack it loose a little bit just to make sure they line up. Grab the retaining pin and put that back through. All right, before we go any further, let's reconnect our vacuum line to the two little connectors at the back of the hub. And just slide right on there. All right, so next up, what we're gonna do is swing our ABS line back into place on the hub, making sure we're being pretty careful with it. You don't wanna damage that. And then you can take that smaller hex screw and put that back in by hand, and then grab your socket or Allen key and tighten it down. Next, slide your dust shield into place, making sure that the ABS hose is going through that little opening there, and you're lining up these to the open threaded holes. Put those 8mm bolts back in, all 3 of them, before tightening them down, just to make sure they're all lined up properly. All right, grab your 8 socket and tighten them down. All right, so now you can grab your rotor and put it back on the hub. I'm gonna take one of our lug nuts and I'm gonna thread it on the stud just so the rotor doesn't pop loose when we're trying to put the caliper on. I find this to make your life a little easier. All right, so next we're gonna take our caliper off the hanger on the frame and slide that guy back onto the rotor. Grab the factory nuts and put them back through. Now you can grab your socket and tighten them down. All right, so now I'm gonna grab my swivel socket and my 21 socket and tighten down our caliper bracket bolts. Next, we can tackle the ABS and brake line brackets. Now, if you remember correctly, the ABS line is an 8mm, then the brake line has 2 10mm ones. So let's take those guys right off of the knuckle here. All right, now the last step here would be to reconnect our sway bar end link. Now, unfortunately, with a lift kit here, it can be pretty difficult, depending on the lift kit size, to actually get the sway bar bolt to come back through enough to put your nut on top. And that's gonna be the case here. Now, from here, you have 2 options. One, start repeating this exact same process on the other side of the front, and when you disconnect the sway bar over there, it loosens it up and gives you the ability to flex it downward to put the nuts back on. Option 2 would be to put the weight of the vehicle back down on itself, and when it pushes down and lifts the suspension back up with the wheel, it will push the stud back through. So you can take 2 options. We're gonna go ahead and repeat on the other side, and then we'll be able to finish the sway bar up. But from here, guys, you wanna make sure you're torquing down all of your bolts as well. Definitely don't forget about that. Make sure you're looking up the proper torque specs for your specific year, gen, and model. With that said, that'll wrap up the install. Just repeat on the other side and you'll be good to go. That's gonna wrap up my review and install for the Rough Country 2-inch leveling strut extensions available for the 09 and newer F-150, excluding 10 to 14 Raptors. You can pick your kit up right here at AmericanTrucks.com.